All internal combustion engines produce a lot of vibrations, even if they are naturally well balanced. To prevent those vibrations from entering the cabin, engine mounts have rubber between the engine and the chassis. And like all rubber parts found in the engine bay, the rubber engine mounts will degrade over time and start to crack. The main symptom of a bad engine mount is increased vibrations in the cabin, especially when the engine is idling. Odd noises are also common, and so is delayed throttle response. You might also notice that the engine is slanted, and you might hear a loud knock each time you accelerate or brake. In more high-end cars, a bad engine mount can also trigger a check engine light and even limp mode. Symptoms of a bad engine mount. 1. Increased engine vibrations. Engine mounts are made so that they allow the engine to vibrate to a certain degree. The rubber inside the engine mount absorbs those vibrations and prevents them from shaking up the cabin and the entire interior. Over time, the rubber hardens and compresses. Sometimes the rubber will even tear or disintegrate, causing chunks of it to fall out. That naturally leaves a lot more room for the engine to move around, which increases vibrations. Then, because the rubber isn't absorbing those vibrations, you will definitely feel them inside the cabin. You might even notice that the dashboard is shaking violently if you drive an older car. Those vibrations are most pronounced when the engine is idling and when you first start moving in first gear. It will also be easy to notice when you open the hood and look at the engine. All engines are supposed to move a bit when idling, but if the movement is more than 1 inch, something is definitely wrong. It's also worth mentioning that diesel engines and V-configuration engines vibrate the most, making it easier to notice any unusual movements. 2. Weird noises coming from the engine bay. With the engine moving around and shaking, some weird noises are bound to occur. They are usually very loud and easy to notice inside the cabin. The noises range from scraping and squealing to clunking and grinding. What type of noise you will hear depends on the car, but as long as it's coming from the engine bay and there are excess vibrations, you can be sure it's the engine mounts causing it. Scraping usually happens when a piece of metal touches the chassis. That's most often the exhaust manifold shield touching the firewall or the impact rails if it's a V engine. Intermittent squealing happens if a rubber part grinds against the chassis. That's most often a coolant hose or a vacuum line. If you hear this type of noise, it's important to inspect all the hoses because it might crack soon. That will cause the engine to overhear and lead to even more damage. It's also important to mention that a bad idler pulley can cause intermittent squealing as well. Lastly, clunking and grinding usually come from the engine mounts. Without any rubber to hold the engine, the metal part of the mount will hit the chassis. That causes loud clunking or loud grinding depending on the car. 3. Slightly delayed throttle response. A delayed throttle response usually indicates a problem with the fuel system or air intake metering system. In those cases, the engine won't respond to throttle inputs promptly. But if an engine mount is bad, the engine will respond in time and the RPMs will rise, but the car won't start accelerating right away. That's because the engine can move and twist when the engine mounts are bad. What happens is you push the gas pedal and the engine first twists because it can move. Only once the engine mounts hit the chassis does the power of the engine go to the wheels instead of moving the engine around. When this happens, you will also notice a jolt and that the RPMs drop slightly or at least slow down. This is a serious problem that can cause a lot of other damage down the road. If you are going to keep driving a car like this, make sure to go easy on the throttle. Each of those jolts can rip something off like a wire or a hose and cause thousands worth of damage. It can also damage the chassis mounts, which calls for welding and painting, and that's not cheap either. It's also important to ease off the gas pedal slowly because the engine mount will hit the chassis in the other direction too. 4. Loud knock coming from the engine bay when accelerating or braking. A single loud knock coming from the engine bay when you first get on the gas pedal or the brake pedal is caused by the same thing we described previously. The engine is twisting around too much, and the engine mount is hitting the chassis each time you accelerate or brake. Again, make sure to go easy on the gas pedal to minimize the chances of causing more damage. On another note, a single clunk or knock can also be caused by a bad front differential. That's only if the vehicle is four-wheel drive with a transfer case, otherwise, there is no front differential as such. This can also be the only symptom of a bad front differential, but it can't be the only symptom of a bad engine mount. Ergo, if there are no excess vibrations or any other of the symptoms we will go into, check the differential first. 5. slanted engine. All engines have multiple engine mounts. Some engines have 3, some have 4, and some have more. Depending on which one of these engine mounts goes, the engine will slant to one of 3 sides. That can be in the direction of the firewall, or in the direction of one of the wheels, left or right. How much the engine will slant depends on the car. The slanting can be barely noticeable, and some engine mounts don't allow the engine to slant even when they are worn out. But in some cases, it can be extremely bad and easily noticeable where the engine will drop down on one side by a few inches or more. If you notice this, it's best to stop driving the car or at least only make one trip to a repair shop. A severely slanted engine puts a lot more strain on the transmission, the drive shafts, and the differentials. If any of these components fail, it will result in at least a $400 repair bill. The engine can also pull some of the wires, rip them out, or break them. The same goes for vacuum lines and hoses, and that too can lead to hundreds, if not thousands of dollars worth of damage. 6. Check engine light and/or limp mode. Engine mounts don't have any wires or control modules that allow the engine control unit to diagnose them. But if a bad engine mount causes delayed acceleration, it will most likely trigger a check engine light and even limp mode. When you push the gas pedal, the engine control unit notes that, and it notices that the engine is accelerating. But since it doesn't notice the vehicle speed increasing, and it doesn't note any wheel spin, it triggers a check engine light. But if it doesn't assume what the exact problem is, it will only trigger limp mode without any fault codes. In limp mode, the engine has reduced power and limited top speed, and it might be stuck in one gear. If you do get a check engine light, fault codes related to the ABS system, traction control, engine timing, wheel speed sensors, and different control modules are all possible. These are all misleading, which is why if you notice any of the other symptoms, you should first check the engine mounts. How to diagnose a bad engine mount. Diagnosing a bad engine mount can be as easy as starting the engine, or it could be so complicated that you need a 2-post car lift. Unless the easier tests disclose something, you will have to take the car to a repair shop for a professional diagnosis. And the first test is opening the hood and having someone start the engine. At the same time, you keep an eye on the engine movement as it cranks and fires up. If you notice that the engine moves front to back violently, and by more than an inch or two, it's fairly safe to suspect a bad engine mount. And if it moves by several inches, it's most certainly one of the engine mounts. The next test is even simpler. You turn the engine off, put the handbrake on, and grab the engine. Pull the engine front and back or side to side as hard as you can. If you notice any free play in the engine, one of the engine mounts is definitely bad. The engine is supposed to move slightly, but it should also show resistance the entire time. The last test involves putting the car up on a 2-post lift and putting tension on each of the mounts with a pry bar. That gives you a lot more leverage over the engine and also gives you access to the engine mounts under the car. And don't do this on jack stands because the car will move and jerk too much for it to be safe. Cost to replace an engine mount. How much you will pay for a new engine mount largely depends on the car. A simple rubber mount for older vehicles can cost as little as $15 at AutoZone. But more complex mounts for newer vehicles cost anywhere between $100 and $250, sometimes even more. The average price for a new engine mount across all cars is $80. Labor costs vary even more. Some engine mounts can be replaced in no more than 15 minutes, but some of them require the engine to be lifted, which can take an hour and a half at the very least. That brings us to a labor cost range of $50 to $250. The average cost is around $100, or 1 hour of labor. That brings the total average with parts included to $200, with the low being $70 and the high around $500. Can you replace an engine mount yourself? Replacing an engine mount at home is possible, but it all depends on which engine mount is bad. If the engine mount you need to replace is accessible from the top of the engine bay, then it's possible, but you will need a car jack. But if the engine mount is under the car, then it's best left to professionals for your own safety. It's also not worth explaining how to replace an engine mount, because each of them is so different that a general guide won't be of much use. Your best chance of replacing it is by finding a good model-specific guide, or by getting a workshop manual for your specific vehicle. What damages engine mounts? The number one cause of engine mount damage is simply time. The rubber on the engine mounts is bound to disintegrate eventually due to water, salt, UV rays, and road grime. But even so, an engine mount should last over 100,000 miles at least. But some things can cause it to fail sooner, like your driving style and engine liquids. If you are an aggressive driver and you like to dump the clutch a little too often, it causes the engine to jerk violently and destroy the engine mounts. Coolant and engine oil leaks will also damage rubber, and it's easy for them to drip onto the engine mount as it sits right below the engine. But other than that, it's down to factory defects if it fails prematurely. To summarize what we talked about in this video, ultimately, all of the main engine mount symptoms have to do with excessive engine movement, vibrations, and weird noises. But instead of relying on the symptoms, you can just test the mounts, which is fairly easy. You just start the engine and watch for any violent and excessive movements as the engine fires up, and then punch the gas pedal a few times to see if it moves. It's okay for the engine to move and vibrate somewhat, but movements of more than an inch or two are an immediate red flag and a sign that one of the engine mounts is bad. I hope this video helped. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to like and follow so you don't miss any of my videos.